The fastest way to learn is not by memorizing, but by playing with ideas until they feel natural. Try to explain them out loud as if you were teaching a child. If you need to memorize, it's because you haven't understood. And if you haven't understood, you haven't learned. This method is a trap. You might be able to repeat words, but you won't truly understand anything. And when an exam, or life itself, demands that you use that knowledge, it simply won't be there. But here's the secret. Whenever you learn something new, don't be satisfied with just storing it in your head. Speak it out loud. Explain it. Teach it. If there's no one around, teach it to yourself. Talk to yourself in your room, in the car, while you walk, even in the shower. Turn thoughts into words. When you can speak clearly and naturally, as if you were explaining it to someone else, that's when the knowledge becomes yours. Listen carefully. There's one infallible sign that someone truly understands an idea: the ability to make it simple. Anyone can hide behind complicated words, but only those who really understand can explain with clarity. Let me put it clearly. If you can't explain it simply, you haven't understood it. Repeating complex terms might impress the uninformed, but it doesn't fool reality. If you can't simplify it, you don't master it. When a concept still feels confusing, tangled with too many loose details, the problem isn't the subject itself. The problem is how you organized it in your mind. But when you can take that same concept and translate it into direct, logical, and accessible words, then you've reached true understanding. And here's the central point. Simplicity doesn't weaken knowledge, it strengthens it. The simpler it is, the more essential. The more essential, the more unforgettable. Information stops being a burden you carry and becomes a tool you can use any time. That's why the greatest scientists, philosophers, and geniuses always sought clarity. They knew the mind doesn't need to drown in complexity. The mind needs to see the structure. When you learn to do this, you don't just understand better, you never forget. That is the path of real learning, not accumulating words, but distilling until only what matters remains. Every time you explain something, you strengthen your mind. It's like a muscle that doesn't grow at rest, but under challenge. Explaining is that challenge. It forces the brain to organize, review, connect, and test what it has learned. Think about it. When you only read or listen, you're in a passive position. It's as if information flows through you without taking root. But when you force yourself to teach, even if it's only to yourself, your mind changes gears. You leave the passive mode and enter the active one. You're no longer just receiving, you're producing, creating clarity. And here's the magic. In this process, the brain reveals what you still don't understand. If you get stuck, if you can't explain a detail, that means you've uncovered a gap in your knowledge. And that's wonderful, because now you know exactly where to improve. You're no longer in the dark. At the same time, every time you manage to explain something clearly, something powerful happens. The knowledge sticks. It takes deep root. It stops being a temporary visitor and becomes a permanent part of your mental structure. That's why, once you explain something well, you'll rarely forget it afterward. This cycle, learn, explain, correct, and fix, is what accelerates your growth in any area. The more often you repeat it, the stronger your mind becomes. It's like training every day. With discipline, you reach results that seem impossible to those who never practice. And this is exactly how the greatest thinkers reached the level of genius. They didn't memorize, they didn't pile up dead information. They turned explanation into their training ground. And with every explanation, they became faster, clearer, and deeper. Now, I want you to understand something fundamental. This method shouldn't be used only once in a while. It must become a daily habit. The secret isn't in long study sessions, but in constant repetition, in training your mind during small intervals. You don't need hours of absolute silence or perfect conditions. On the contrary, great learners use any moment. If you're waiting for a bus, explain quietly what you just studied. If you're walking, teach yourself the concept you learned earlier that morning. If you're alone in your room, speak out loud as if you were giving a lesson. These stolen minutes of the day are hidden treasures. Most people waste them getting lost in useless distractions. You, however, can use them as a training ground for your brain. It's in these moments that knowledge solidifies, because you're not just reviewing, you're organizing and simplifying. But understand this, you don't need to be perfect. Many times you'll stumble, forget, get stuck, and that's exactly where the power lies. Those stumbles reveal the gaps you still need to strengthen. With each attempt, you come back sharper, clearer, more confident. When this becomes a habit, something extraordinary happens. You start to think differently. Your mind becomes trained to seek clarity in everything. You begin to organize ideas automatically, to separate the essential from the unnecessary, to communicate better without effort. And all of this is born from simple minutes scattered throughout the day. This is how a sharp mind is built, not through endless hours of forced memorization, but through small, constant rituals of explanation. A little every day, anywhere, always. Now pay very close attention, because this can change the way you deal with procrastination. Whenever you feel stuck, unmotivated to start, use this method as an immediate action trigger. Instead of waiting for the right time to study or work, simply begin by explaining what you need to learn. When you explain out loud, your mind is forced to focus. It can't wander, it can't drift away. You cut through the cycle of procrastination because speaking demands presence. It's impossible to procrastinate while you're producing clarity. And here's a transformative detail. Say out loud phrases that reprogram your mind not to procrastinate. Declare, I act now. I don't postpone. I make it happen. When you hear your own voice, you create a powerful internal command. It's as if your brain is forced to believe it and obey. That's the trick. Don't wait for motivation to act. Create movement, and motivation will follow. As you hear yourself explaining, you generate an immediate sense of progress. You realize you already know something, that you've already advanced. That small step builds confidence, and confidence builds action. Procrastination is born from confusion, from the feeling that something is too big or too difficult. But when you explain, everything breaks down into simple parts. What once seemed like an insurmountable monster suddenly becomes a clear sequence of steps, and in that moment, fear disappears. The great geniuses never waited for inspiration to fall from the sky. They created clarity first, and clarity pulled everything else forward. That's exactly what you must do. Whenever you feel stuck, stop and explain. Teach yourself out loud, even if it's just for 60 seconds. That single minute is enough to break inertia and put you into motion. And once movement begins, procrastination loses its power. You're no longer a hostage to feeling like it because you've already created discipline. Now listen closely, because here's the point that separates the average student from someone who learns in an extraordinary way. The brain truly learns when it recreates. In this process, you discover paths that were never in the book, explanations even the teacher never gave, metaphors that make sense only to you. Knowledge stops being external and becomes something shaped by your own mind. That's why geniuses seem to see the world differently. They don't memorize ready-made formulas. They reinvent, simplify, adapt. They turn every concept into something alive. And when you do this, you learn in a way that is never the same as anyone else, because no one else will ever explain it with the same words you used. Think about it. If you can explain the law of gravity with a falling apple, or explain a math formula using an example from your daily life, it means you've mastered it. You no longer depend on the original way you received the information. You own it. This is how you must learn from now on. Don't copy, recreate. Don't memorize, explain. Don't repeat, transform. That is the mark of great thinkers, and it's what will place you far above average. Now listen with your full attention. If you take this method seriously, if you truly commit to teaching yourself every single day, something extraordinary will happen. You will leap far ahead of most people. While the majority remain stuck in rote memorization, repeating words without understanding, you'll be building real knowledge, solid and unshakable. While others study for hours and forget the next day, you'll learn in minutes and remember forever. While they feel insecure, you'll stand with confidence, clarity, and mastery. That is the power of teaching yourself, the power of simplifying, of recreating, of turning the difficult into the easy. It's what separates those who merely get by from those who become true references. It's what turns an ordinary student into someone brilliant, capable of mastering any subject and applying it in real life. And here's the truth. You don't need to be a genius to learn like a genius. You need discipline, effort, and the courage to practice a method that seems almost too simple to be true. And that's precisely why so few ever use it. But those who do surge ahead. So let me tell you this. Every time you get up and dedicate a few minutes to teaching yourself, you're gaining ground. You're building an advantage that compounds day after day until the world can no longer ignore you. That is the real power of. It's not about storing information in your head. It's about transforming information into clarity, clarity into action, and action into results. Do this, and you will never be the same again. Now I want you to make a pact. Write in the comments, "I choose to learn like a genius." This phrase is your declaration that you will no longer live in the mediocrity of rote memorization, but will transform every study session into clarity, every concept into mastery. And if this lesson resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to keep elevating your learning. And remember, those who teach, learn. Those who simplify, master. Those who practice this every day become unstoppable. What if everything you think you know about learning is wrong? Not just slightly off, but fundamentally backwards. Most people believe that intelligence is something fixed, that the brain has limits you're born with. They think memorizing information is the same as understanding it. They assume that if something feels difficult, they're simply not smart enough. But here's what's fascinating. The brain doesn't work the way most people think it does. There are levels to how the mind operates. Not levels of intelligence in the sense of who's smarter than whom, but levels of how deeply you can engage with any piece of knowledge. And here's the remarkable part. Anyone can move through these levels. It's not about talent or natural ability. It's about understanding how thinking actually works. The problem is that most people never make it past the first level. They stop at the surface, believing they've learned something when they've barely scratched it. And then they wonder why information slips away, why problems that seem similar feel completely new, why knowledge doesn't seem to stick or connect to anything else. Let's talk about what really happens when someone tries to learn something. Picture a student sitting with a textbook on physics, or mathematics, or history. They read through a chapter. The words make sense as they go by. They might even highlight important passages, write notes in the margins. At the end, they feel like they've learned something. They close the book with a sense of accomplishment. But what's actually happened? The information has passed through their eyes, been processed into words, and created a very shallow impression in the mind. It's like running your hand over the surface of water. There's contact, but nothing fundamental has changed. This is the first level, and it's where most people live their entire lives. Reading without engagement, listening without questioning, absorbing information the way a sponge absorbs water,
only to have it evaporate just as quickly. The real work begins when you move beyond this surface interaction. And that brings us to what the brain actually needs to build genuine understanding. The first real level of engagement happens when you stop accepting information passively and start testing it, not just nodding along as words flow past, but actively checking whether you actually understand what's being said. This sounds simple, but most people never do it. Here's how you know you're at this level. Close the book. Put down the paper. Now, without looking, can you explain what you just read? Not recite it word for word, but explain the concept in your own language? Most people can't. They realize, suddenly, that while the words made sense as they read them, nothing actually stuck. The ideas didn't transform into understanding. This is what separates passive absorption from active learning. The brain needs to reconstruct information in its own terms to truly hold on to it. When you force yourself to explain something without looking at the source, you're making the brain do real work. You're creating connections, building mental models, translating abstract symbols into concrete understanding. Think about what happens when someone reads a mathematics problem. They see symbols, equations, numbers. If they're at the surface level, they might follow along with the solution, nodding as each step makes sense. But close the book and ask them to solve a similar problem, and they're lost. Why? Because they never forced their brain to actually work through the logic. They watched someone else's thinking without doing any thinking themselves. The second level is where real engagement begins. This is where you take any piece of information and break it down to its simplest possible form, not dumbing it down, but stripping away all the complicated language and fancy terminology to find the core idea underneath. Every complex concept, no matter how sophisticated it seems, can be reduced to simple pieces. The brain understands simple things. It builds up from simple to complex naturally. But when you try to stuff complicated explanations into your head without breaking them down first, you're asking the brain to do something it's not designed for. Here's a test. Can you explain the idea to someone who knows nothing about the subject? Not another expert, not someone who shares your technical vocabulary, but someone completely outside the field? If you can't do that, you don't really understand it yourself. You're just carrying around someone else's complicated explanation. This is harder than it sounds. It requires you to abandon the impressive-sounding language, the technical jargon, the formal definitions. It forces you to confront what you actually understand versus what you've merely memorized. When you try to explain something simply and discover you can't, that's not failure. That's discovering where your understanding has gaps. The brain loves simplicity. It naturally seeks the clearest, most direct path to understanding. But education systems often do the opposite, wrapping simple ideas in layers of complexity, as if difficulty itself signals importance. Strip all that away. Find the simple core. The third level is where things get interesting. This is where you start seeing connections between things that seemed unrelated. The brain doesn't store information in isolated boxes. It builds networks, webs of association where one idea links to another, and another, until everything starts connecting. Think about someone studying physics and music separately. They might never realize that the mathematics of wave equations describes both the motion of particles and the nature of sound. They might never see that rhythm and frequency are the same fundamental concept appearing in different contexts. But once you start looking for connections, they're everywhere. This is how genuine understanding develops. Not by memorizing thousands of separate facts, but by building a connected framework where each new piece of information slots into an existing structure. When you understand something this way, you can't forget it. It's woven into how you think. Here's how to develop this. Whenever you learn something new, ask yourself what else it reminds you of. What other areas use similar principles? What analogies can you draw? The brain is an analogy machine. It understands new things by relating them to things it already knows. Feed that natural tendency. Someone studying biology might notice that natural selection works like market competition. Someone learning about electricity might see parallels with water flowing through pipes. These aren't just clever comparisons. They're how the brain actually builds understanding, by mapping new territory, using familiar landmarks. The fourth level is where you become genuinely dangerous in the best possible way. This is where you stop accepting explanations at face value and start questioning everything. Not skepticism for its own sake, but genuine curiosity about why things work the way they claim to work. The brain learns more from questions than from answers. When you ask a real question, something you genuinely don't understand, your mind becomes alert. It starts actively searching for patterns, testing possibilities, building models. This is the brain's natural state of engagement, but most people never question anything. They accept what they're told, especially if it comes from an authority, a textbook, a respected source. They mistake accepting information for understanding it. Real understanding only comes when you've questioned something deeply enough to see why it must be true, why it couldn't work any other way. Here's what this looks like in practice. Someone tells you a fact. Instead of filing it away, ask why. Why is that true? What would happen if it weren't true? What assumptions are built into that explanation? What evidence supports it? What else would have to be true for this to work? This isn't about being contrary or difficult. It's about engaging with ideas at a level where they actually make sense to you personally. The brain needs to test things, probe them, turn them over, and examine them from different angles. That's how it builds solid understanding rather than fragile memorization. When you question something deeply enough, one of two things happens. Either you find that the explanation holds up under scrutiny, in which case your understanding becomes much stronger, or you find gaps and weaknesses, in which case you've learned something even more valuable, where the explanation breaks down, where the mystery still lies. The fifth level is where everything comes together. This is where you take what you understand and explain it to someone else. Not just recite it, but genuinely teach it in a way that makes sense to another person. There's something almost magical about teaching. When you try to help someone else understand something, you discover aspects of your own understanding you didn't know were there. You find holes you didn't realize existed. You're forced to think about the material in new ways, from new angles, anticipating questions and confusions. The brain reorganizes information when it prepares to teach. It has to. Teaching requires you to model another person's mind, to imagine what they don't know, what will confuse them, what examples will make things clear. This process of mental modeling deepens your own understanding in ways that studying alone never can. Picture someone who's learned to solve a type of math problem. They can work through the steps, get the right answer, but ask them to teach someone else how to solve it, and suddenly they're thinking about it differently. Why does this step come before that one? What's the logic? How would you explain it to someone who's completely lost? In answering those questions, their own understanding transforms. This is why the best way to learn something is to plan to teach it. Even if you never actually teach anyone, the mental preparation, the reorganization of knowledge, the search for clear explanations, all of that does something to how the information sits in your mind. Now, what's actually happening in the brain as you move through these levels? The traditional view of memory is all wrong. People think of memory like a filing cabinet where information gets stored in drawers, retrieved when needed, put back when finished. But that's not how it works at all. Memory is reconstruction. Every time you recall something, you're not pulling out a stored file. You're rebuilding the information from pieces, from associations, from fragments scattered across different networks in the brain. And here's what's crucial. The easier it is to reconstruct something, the better you remember it. That's why passive reading doesn't work. You're not building the connections needed for easy reconstruction. The information passes through without creating the dense web of associations that makes recall natural and effortless. Each level we've talked about builds more connections. Testing yourself forces the brain to practice reconstruction. Simplifying creates clear pathways. Finding connections adds more roots to the same information. Questioning strengthens the logical structure. Teaching forces the most complete reorganization of all. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to remember a path through a forest. If you've walked it once, barely paying attention, you'll struggle to find it again. But if you've walked it many times, from different directions, in different weather, while explaining the route to others, while thinking about why the path goes where it goes, then that path becomes part of the landscape of your mind. You can't get lost because you understand the territory. This is what real learning looks like. Not memorizing routes, but understanding territory. Here's how this works in practice. Say you're trying to understand something difficult, something that seems beyond you. Maybe it's advanced mathematics, or a complex theory, or a technical skill. Most people give up when it feels too hard. But now you have a framework. Start at level 1. Don't just read about it passively. Read a section, then close the book and try to recall it. You'll probably fail. That's fine. That failure is information. It tells you what didn't stick, where your understanding is weak. Move to level 2. Take whatever you could recall and try to explain it as simply as possible. Pretend you're explaining to a child or someone who knows nothing about the field. Where do you struggle? Those are the concepts you don't actually understand yet. Progress to level 3. Look for connections. What does this remind you of? What other fields use similar ideas? What analogies can you draw? Build bridges between this new knowledge and things you already understand solidly. Advance to level 4. Question everything. Why must this be true? What would happen if it weren't? What assumptions are hidden in the explanation? What alternative explanations might exist? Push against the ideas until they either hold firm or reveal their weaknesses. Reach level 5. Prepare to teach it. Write out an explanation as if for someone else. Draw diagrams, think of examples, anticipate confusions. You'll find your understanding deepening with every attempt. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it works for anything. Physics, mathematics, history, language, art, music, any skill or knowledge domain. The levels don't change. The brain's need for active engagement, simplification, connection, questioning, and teaching remains constant. And here's what most people miss. This isn't about working harder. It's about working differently. You could spend 10 hours passively reading and retain almost nothing. Or you could spend 2 hours actively engaging at these deeper levels and build understanding that lasts. The brain doesn't reward time. It rewards engagement. There's something profound here about the nature of understanding itself. Real knowledge isn't something you have. It's something you can do. You understand physics not because you've memorized formulas, but because you can solve problems, make predictions, see connections. You understand history not because you've memorized dates, but because you can explain why events unfolded as they did, what forces were at play. Understanding is active. It's a capability, not a possession. That's why these levels matter so much. They transform knowledge from dead information into living capability. They change you from someone who's heard about ideas into someone who can think with those ideas, who can use them, extend them, apply them in new contexts. The mind isn't a container to be filled, it's a fire to be lit. And these levels, these ways of engaging with knowledge, they're the kindling that makes that fire burn bright. So here's what you need to do. Pick something you want to understand, something that matters to you. It doesn't have to be academic. It could be how engines work, or how to play an instrument, or understanding people better. Whatever it is, commit to engaging with it differently. Don't just read about it. Test yourself. Simplify it. Find connections. Question it. Prepare to teach it. Move through each level deliberately. Watch what happens to your understanding. You'll notice something strange. The more you engage this way, the easier it becomes. Your brain adapts. It starts automatically looking for connections, asking questions, building models. These levels become natural rather than forced. Understanding stops being something you struggle toward and becomes something you build naturally. That's when you realize the truth about the brain's power. It's not limited by capacity, it's limited by how you engage it. Give it passive absorption and it stays dormant. Give it active engagement and it becomes something extraordinary. The choice has always been yours.
Rio de Janeiro, 1952. A physics professor walks into his university lecture hall and writes a simple question on the board. What makes an angle in a crystal? 80 students stare back. Perfect silence. He tries again, rephrasing. Nothing. These are advanced physics students who just aced their quantum mechanics exam last week. They should know this cold. What Feynman discovered in that classroom would expose a crisis in education that still devastates millions of students today. This comes from Richard Feynman's documented teaching experience in Brazil, recorded in his memoir, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, and verified through archives at the Centro Brasileiro de Pesquisas Físicas. The physicist who would later win the Nobel Prize and revolutionize our understanding of quantum mechanics spent nearly 2 years teaching in South America. He expected brilliant minds eager to unlock the mysteries of physics. He found something else entirely. Feynman arrived in Rio in 1951 as a visiting professor, hired to strengthen Brazil's emerging physics program. The university boasted modern facilities, ambitious students, and a curriculum imported directly from America's top institutions. On paper, everything looked promising. The students attended every lecture, took meticulous notes, and spent hours studying in the library. Their exam scores were immaculate, perfect recitation of Maxwell's equations, flawless reproduction of thermodynamic principles. These weren't struggling students, they were academic superstars. But something felt wrong. During his third week, Feynman demonstrated polarized light using 2 calcite crystals. He held them up, rotated one, and watched the light intensity change. Basic optics, first-year material. He asked the class to explain what they were seeing. Blank stares. "But you just had a whole semester on electromagnetic waves," Feynman said, genuinely confused. One brave student raised his hand. "Professor, we studied electromagnetic waves. We did not study calcite crystals." That's when Feynman began to suspect he wasn't teaching physics. He was witnessing something far more disturbing, a perfect system for preventing learning while maintaining the illusion of education. He designed an experiment. In the next class, he asked students to define Brewster's angle. Hands shot up. They recited the textbook definition word for word, including the mathematical formula. Impressive. Then Feynman asked, "Look at the bay outside this window. Can you see how the light reflects off the water at different angles? Is Brewster's angle happening right now?" The room went silent. They had memorized Brewster's angle so thoroughly they could write essays about it. But they couldn't recognize it happening 30 feet away. This pattern repeated in every topic. Students could recite Newton's laws, but couldn't explain why a bicycle stays upright. They knew the formula for kinetic energy, but looked confused when asked about a ball rolling down a ramp. They had learned physics the way someone might memorize a foreign phrase book without understanding the language. Feynman tried different approaches. He simplified questions. He used real objects instead of abstract symbols. He asked them to predict simple outcomes before calculating anything. Nothing worked. The more he probed, the more obvious it became. His students had spent years studying physics without ever thinking about physics. But here's where the story gets darker. These students weren't lazy. They weren't stupid. They studied harder than most American students Feynman had taught. They spent entire nights memorizing textbooks. Their dedication was absolute. That was precisely the problem. Feynman started investigating the Brazilian education system beyond his classroom. He attended other lectures, reviewed exam papers, talked with students from different universities. What he discovered was a machinery of knowledge destruction operating at industrial scale. Students learned that professors asked questions in predictable patterns, memorize the exact phrasing from textbooks, reproduce it verbatim on exams, and you succeeded. Every incentive pointed toward memorization. Every assessment rewarded recitation. The entire system had evolved to measure the appearance of learning while actively preventing actual understanding. One evening, Feynman met with a group of engineering students preparing for their final exams. He watched them quiz each other. "What is the definition of triboluminescence?" one asked. Another student recited, "Triboluminescence is the light emitted when crystals are crushed." Perfect answer. Textbook definition. Feynman interrupted. "Have any of you ever seen this happen?" Confused looks. "Seen what?" "Triboluminescence, light from crushing crystals. You can do it with sugar cubes in the dark." None of them had. They were memorizing the definition of a phenomenon they'd never witnessed, couldn't imagine, and wouldn't recognize if it happened in front of them. Feynman realized these students were trapped in what he later called cargo cult science. They had all the superficial forms of learning without any of the substance. They possessed the vocabulary of physics, but none of its power. They could pass any test, yet solve no real problems. You've felt this frustration when you've crammed for an exam, aced it, then couldn't remember anything a week later. That hollow feeling when you realize you memorized your way through material without understanding any of it. Feynman students experience this every single day, but the system told them they were succeeding. This wasn't just about Brazilian education in 1952. This was about the fundamental difference between two types of knowledge: knowledge that decorates the mind versus knowledge that transforms it. The Brazilian students had accumulated facts like decorative objects. Each definition, each formula, each principle sat in their minds as a separate, isolated piece. When asked about Brewster's angle, they retrieved the Brewster's angle fact. When asked about reflection, they retrieved the reflection fact. But these facts never connected. They never formed a web of understanding that could respond to novel situations. Real physicists think differently. They build models, mental simulations of how the world works. When Feynman looked at light reflecting off water, his mind automatically ran physics, not because he memorized light reflects at Brewster's angle off water, but because he understood electromagnetic waves, understood how they interact with matter, and could predict outcomes from fundamental principles. The students had no models, they had scripts. And scripts only work when reality follows the exact scenarios you've memorized. Feynman confronted this head-on in his final lecture. He stood before the assembled faculty and students and delivered what accounts describe as a devastating critique. He told them their system produced students who pass examinations and pass them pretty well, but in which we do not know anything except what we have memorized. The room erupted in defensive arguments. Professors insisted their methods were sound. Look at the test scores. Students protested that they worked incredibly hard. How dare he suggest they knew nothing? But Feynman wasn't attacking their effort. He was exposing their tragedy. These brilliant minds had invested years in a system designed to prevent them from becoming scientists while convincing them they were succeeding. He put it plainly in a quote that still reverberates through education debates. After a lot of investigation, I finally figured out that the students had memorized everything, but they didn't know what anything meant. Let that sink in. They didn't know what anything meant. Every formula was a magic spell. Every definition was empty words. They could reproduce the entire textbook without comprehending a single concept. This reveals something crucial about how knowledge actually works. Real understanding isn't about storage. It's about transformation. When you truly learn physics, you don't just acquire new facts. You acquire new ways of seeing. Light stops being just light and becomes electromagnetic waves propagating through space. Motion, it stops being just movement and becomes the interplay of forces, energy, and momentum. Feynman's students never experienced this transformation. They treated education as data entry, pour information into brain, retrieve information on demand. But human minds don't work like hard drives. We understand through connection, through application, through watching ideas collide and transform. The same principle applies today when you watch tutorial videos at 2x speed, highlight textbooks in multiple colors, or create elaborate notes you never review. You're building the appearance of learning while avoiding the actual work, grappling with ideas until they yield their meaning. Modern education has perfected the Brazilian system's flaws. We have students who watch lecture videos and feel like they understand, then freeze on the exam. We have professionals who complete certifications without gaining competence. We have entire industries built on courses that provide certificates rather than capabilities. The markers of fake learning are everywhere. Someone can explain a concept to you, but can't answer basic what-if questions. Someone's resume lists impressive credentials, but they can't solve simple problems in their field. Someone has read dozens of books on a topic, but their thinking hasn't changed at all. You recognize this in yourself when you realize you've been studying something for months, but still can't use it. When you need to look up the basics every time. When you can recognize the right answer on a multiple-choice test, but couldn't generate it from scratch. Feynman identified the mechanism behind this failure. The Brazilian students weren't building knowledge from the ground up. They were memorizing the finished product. They learned conclusions without premises, results without derivations, formulas without the logic that produced them. It's like trying to understand a building by memorizing a photograph. You might accurately describe what it looks like, but you won't understand why it stands up, how the weight distributes, or what happens if you remove a support beam. Real learning starts with simple questions that demand real thinking. Not define electromagnetic induction, but why does a generator need to spin? Not recite Newton's second law, but predict what happens when I push this cart on a frictionless track. Feynman spent his last months in Brazil trying to demonstrate this approach. He brought broken radios into class and asked students to make them work. No formulas allowed, just think. He took them outside and made them explain ordinary phenomena using physics principles. He banned memorized definitions and demanded explanations in their own words. Some students resisted. This felt harder than memorizing, and it was. Thinking always is. But a few started to break through. They had moments Feynman called the pleasure of finding things out. That electric feeling when understanding clicks and the world suddenly makes sense. Those students learned what it means to know something, not to recite it, not to recognize it, but to command it. To take an idea and turn it over in your mind, test its boundaries, apply it to new situations, and make it yours. Here's what Feynman understood that the Brazilian system missed. Learning is transformation, not accumulation. You don't truly know something until it changes how you see the world, until you can't look at a rainbow without thinking about refraction, until you can't watch a ball drop without seeing acceleration, until the knowledge becomes automatic, instinctive, part of how your mind operates. This is why cramming fails. Why highlighting fails. Why passive note-taking fails. You're trying to accumulate when you need to transform. You're decorating your mind when you need to rewire it. The students who break through are the ones who stop asking, "What should I memorize?" and start asking, "What would happen if..." They're the ones who close the textbook and try to rederive concepts from scratch, who attempt problems before looking at solutions, who teach others and discover their own gaps. They're willing to feel stupid temporarily because they understand that confusion is the raw material of learning. That struggle is where transformation happens. That the discomfort of not knowing is the price of admission to truly understanding. Feynman left Brazil with a reputation as a troublemaker who didn't appreciate the students' hard work, but decades later, his critique proved prophetic. The system he exposed in Rio exists everywhere, in universities that optimize for rankings instead of learning, in professional training that produces certificates instead of competence, in online courses that sell the fantasy of easy expertise. We've built elaborate mechanisms for avoiding the hard work of actual learning, while maintaining perfect appearances. We've created a world where you can have all the credentials and none of the capability, where you can study for years and understand nothing. But we've also proven Feynman right about the solution. The students who break through share one trait. They refuse to pretend. They don't hide behind memorized definitions. They test themselves ruthlessly. They admit what they don't understand and stay in that discomfort until clarity emerges. They ask why until they reach bedrock. They explain concepts to themselves out loud. They seek problems they can't solve and refuse to look at answers until they've genuinely struggled. They know the difference between "I've seen this before" and "I understand this deeply." That difference, between recognition and understanding, between memory and mastery, is what Feynman illuminated in that Brazilian classroom 70 years ago. The crisis he exposed never ended. It just evolved better disguises, which means the question he left hanging in Rio still waits for each of us. Are you learning, or are you just memorizing? Do you understand, or do you just recognize? Can you use what you know, or only repeat it? The next time you feel certain you've learned something, try Feynman's test. Close the resources. Explain it to an empty room. Apply it to a situation you've never seen before. See what happens when you're forced to think instead of recall. That's where real knowledge begins, in the uncomfortable gap between what you thought you knew and what you can actually do. Feynman showed his Brazilian students that gap. Some chose to bridge it. Most chose to ignore it. The choice remains yours.
You know, people often ask me how I remember so much. They think there's some trick, some system I use to store all these equations and principles and ideas in my head. And the truth is, I don't remember most of it, not in the way they think. When I was a young man at MIT, I watched my fellow students stay up all night before exams, cramming formulas into their heads. They'd write them on their hands, repeat them over and over, test each other in the hallways. And the next morning, they'd march into that exam room like soldiers going to battle, hoping desperately that nothing would fall out of their heads before they could write it down on paper. A week later, if you asked them the same question, they'd look at you with blank faces. The information was gone, evaporated, as if they'd never learned it at all. I remember one particular exam in my junior year, advanced calculus. The fella sitting next to me, brilliant guy, worked harder than anyone I knew, had spent 2 weeks memorizing theorems and proofs. He had flashcards, study groups, the whole works. I'd see him in the library at midnight muttering formulas to himself. The day of the exam, he froze. He could remember the first line of a proof, but not where it went. He knew there was a theorem that applied, but couldn't quite recall its exact statement. He'd built a house of cards, and when one card slipped, the whole thing came down. 6 months later, I asked him about one of those theorems, just out of curiosity, wondering how he'd approach a problem I was working on, and he looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. It was all gone. I did something different, though I didn't realize it was different at the time. I just couldn't help myself. You see, I had this problem. I needed to understand where things came from. Not just what they were, but why they were. And that changed everything. Let me tell you what I mean. In my sophomore year, we were learning Maxwell's equations. Beautiful things. Really, 4 equations that describe all of electricity and magnetism. My classmates would write them down, stare at them, try to burn them into their memory. But I couldn't do that. I'd look at one of those equations and I'd think, why does it look like that? Where did Maxwell get this from? And I'd have to work backward, tracing the reasoning, until I could see the whole path from the simple experiments with magnets and wires all the way up to this elegant mathematical statement. It took longer, much longer. Sometimes I'd spend an entire evening just understanding one equation while my roommate memorized all 4 and went to bed. He'd shake his head at me, tell me I was wasting time, that we had an exam in 3 days and I was still fiddling around with the basics. But here's the thing, I never forgot those equations. Not because I have a good memory, but because I didn't memorize them at all. I understood them. There's a world of difference between those two things. You see, memory is a funny thing. We think of it like a filing cabinet, where you put information in and hope you can find it again when you need it. But that's not how it really works. Real memory, the kind that lasts, the kind that's useful, isn't storage at all. It's reconstruction. You're not pulling out a file. You're rebuilding the idea from pieces you understand. Think about your own life for a moment. You remember how to get to your friend's house, don't you? But you're not remembering a list of instructions like, turn left at the 3rd Street, go 0.4 miles, turn right. No, you remember landmarks, feelings, the logic of the route. You remember that big oak tree, the yellow house on the corner? The fact that you're heading toward the river. And from those pieces, you reconstruct the path every time. You couldn't forget it if you tried, because you're not storing it, you're understanding it. Or think about something simpler. You know how to make a cup of coffee, right? But you've never memorized the steps. You don't recite to yourself, first fill the kettle, second boil the water, third put coffee in the cup. You just understand the logic of it. Hot water, coffee, mix them together. The exact sequence emerges from understanding what you're trying to do. And because you understand the purpose, extracting flavor from coffee grounds with hot water, you can adapt. If you don't have a kettle, you can use a pot. If you don't have a cup, you can use a mug. Understanding is flexible. Memorization is rigid. That's what I learned to do with physics, and later with everything else I wanted to truly know. I didn't try to remember. I tried to understand so deeply that forgetting became impossible. Let me give you a real example from my work. When I was at Los Alamos during the war, we were working on some very complex calculations for the atomic bomb project. Horrifying thing, really, but that's another story. The point is, we had these incredibly complicated integrals to solve nasty things that would take pages and pages of algebra to work through. My colleagues would solve them once, carefully write down every step in their notebooks, and then refer back to those notebooks whenever they needed the result. I did it differently. Every single time I needed one of those integrals, I would solve it again from scratch. People thought I was insane. You already did this last week, they'd say. Just look at your notes, but I wouldn't. I'd work through it again, and often I'd find a different path, a cleaner way to reach the answer. And something strange happened after a while. These solutions that took me an hour the first time would take me 20 minutes, then 10, then 5. Not because I was remembering the steps, but because I was understanding the structure. I was seeing the pattern underneath. I started to recognize when a certain substitution would work, not because I'd memorized, use this substitution for this type of problem, but because I could feel how the equations wanted to move. It's hard to explain, but it's like knowing how to dance. You don't remember the steps. You feel the music and your body knows what to do. There was one integral in particular, a really nasty one involving exponentials and oscillating functions that kept coming up in different contexts. The first time I solved it, it took me most of an afternoon. Lots of false starts, integration by parts, clever tricks. The second time it appeared, I started fresh again. This time I found a slightly different approach, and it only took an hour. The third time, I suddenly saw a symmetry I'd missed before, and the whole thing collapsed into something much simpler. By the 10th time, I could practically write down the answer, but not because I'd memorized it. I'd internalized the structure so deeply that solving it felt like answering, what's 2 plus 2? The human brain is remarkable at pattern recognition. We're built for it. We see faces in clouds, hear words in random noise, find meaning in chaos. That's our gift, but we waste it when we try to use our brains like computers, storing raw data. Computers are wonderful at that, we're not. What we're wonderful at is finding connections, seeing relationships, building webs of meaning. So here's what I discovered. If you want to remember something forever, don't try to remember it. Instead, connect it to things you already understand. Build it into your web of knowledge so thoroughly that it becomes part of how you think. When I learned quantum mechanics, truly learned it, not just memorized it. I spent months playing with toy problems. Simple systems, simpler than anything you'd see in a real exam. A particle in a box, a harmonic oscillator. I'd solve them in every way I could think of. I'd draw pictures, make analogies, try to explain them to myself in plain English. And slowly, the principles became part of me. They weren't facts I remembered. They were ways of thinking I had absorbed. I remember one night, lying in bed, unable to sleep because I was thinking about the uncertainty principle. Not the formula, anyone can memorize that, but what it really means. I thought about trying to measure where an electron is. To see it, you need light. But light has momentum, and when it hits the electron, it gives it a kick. The harder you try to pin down the position, the bigger the kick, the more uncertain the momentum becomes. It's not a limitation of our instruments. It's built into the fabric of reality. Position and momentum are complementary ways of describing the same thing, and you can't have both perfectly at once. When I finally felt that, not just knew it, but felt it, I could never forget it. It became part of how I see the world. There's a test I've always used, and I recommend it to anyone who wants to really know something. I call it the Explain It Simply test. Here's how it works. After you think you've learned something, try to explain it to someone who doesn't know it, not using the technical words you just learned. Not by repeating what your teacher said, but in your own words, using everyday analogies and simple language. If you can't do this, you don't understand it. Not really. You've only memorized a sophisticated way of talking about it. And that's the trap that catches so many bright people. They learn the language of a subject, they learn to use the right words in the right order, and they mistake that fluency for understanding. But it's not the same thing at all. I remember when I was learning about entropy and thermodynamics. I could recite the definition. Entropy is a measure of disorder in a system. I could write down the equations, manipulate them, solve problems. But one day, someone asked me to explain it without using any technical terms, and I couldn't. I tried, and it all came out as gibberish. That's when I knew I didn't really understand it. So I went back and thought about it differently. I thought about a drop of ink in water, spreading out. I thought about a messy desk and the natural tendency of things to spread out and mix up. I thought about ice melting in a glass of water. Why does it always go that direction? Why doesn't the water freeze and the ice cube get hotter? I thought about information and certainty. What does it mean for something to be ordered? If I have all the molecules of a gas in one corner of a room, I know where they are. That's information. When they spread out, I've lost that information. The entropy increased. And gradually, I built up a real understanding that didn't depend on the formula. After that, I never had to remember what entropy meant. I knew it. More than that, I could feel it. I could look at any system and have an intuition about what would happen to its entropy. Not because I'd memorized rules, but because I understood the principle. This is why teaching is such a powerful tool for learning. When you try to teach something, you're forced to confront the gaps in your understanding. The questions people ask, often simple questions, reveal where you're relying on memorization instead of understanding. I learned more physics from teaching it than I ever learned from studying it. Every time a student asked me why instead of what, I had to either know the answer or admit I didn't. And admitting I didn't know was often the beginning of really learning. I taught introductory physics for years, and every single semester, some student would ask a question that stopped me in my tracks. Simple questions, usually. Why does a heavier object not fall faster? Why is the sky blue? What actually is energy? And I'd realized that I'd been using these words, manipulating these concepts, but I'd never really thought deeply about the fundamental question they were asking. Those moments were gifts. They forced me to go back and think more carefully, to build a better understanding. There was one student, quiet girl, sat in the back, who asked me why we use different formulas for momentum in relativity versus classical mechanics. I started to give her the standard explanation about how the equations change at high speeds, but she interrupted me. No, she said. I mean, why? What's really different? And I realized I'd been teaching the formulas without teaching the insight, so I started over. I talked about how our everyday intuition about adding velocities breaks down. I talked about what it means for the speed of light to be constant for all observers. I talked about how momentum has to be redefined to maintain conservation laws when these weird things start happening. By the end, I'd understood relativity better than I had before she asked the question. There's something else I discovered, though it took me years to articulate it. Understanding isn't a destination, it's a process. You don't learn something once and then you're done. You come back to it again and again, each time from a different angle, and each time you understand it a little more deeply. I must have learned classical mechanics, Newton's laws, and all that at least a dozen times in my life. Once in high school, again in college, again in graduate school, then again when I taught it, and then again when I had to explain it for lectures or write about it. And every single time, I learned something new. Not new facts, the laws of motion haven't changed, but new understanding, new connections, new ways of seeing why things had to be that way. The first time I learned Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration, I just memorized it. It was a formula you used to solve problems. The second time, I understood it as a definition of force. The third time, I saw how it connected to conservation of momentum. The fourth time, I realized it was really a statement about how systems respond to constraints. Each layer of understanding made the previous layers richer, and none of it required memorization because each new insight was built on genuine comprehension of what came before. This is perhaps the most important thing I can tell you about remembering. The act of forgetting and relearning is not a failure, it's the method. Every time you reconstruct an idea from pieces you understand, you strengthen those connections. You make the pattern more clear. You see more of the structure. I used to work problems over and over, not because I didn't know how to solve them, but because each time through, I'd see something I'd missed before. Maybe I'd noticed that this equation has the same form as one from a different area of physics. Maybe I'd realize that the reason this step works is connected to some deeper principle. These insights don't come from memorizing. They come from doing, from playing, from thinking. There was a whole summer when I just played with special relativity problems. I'd make up scenarios, a train moving past a station, light bouncing between mirrors, twins going on journeys, and I'd work out what different observers would see. Not for any exam, not for any practical purpose, just because I wanted to feel how relativity worked. And after that summer, relativity wasn't something I'd learned. It was something I lived in. I could close my eyes and visualize events in space-time, see how different observers slice up that space-time into their own notions of space and time. You can't memorize that kind of intuition. You can only build it. You know, there's a joy in this approach that I think we often lose in our obsession with efficiency. We want to learn something once and be done with it. Check the box, move on to the next thing. But real understanding is playful. It's curious. It's willing to spend an afternoon just thinking about why things work the way they do. Not because you'll be tested on it, but because it's interesting. I remember sitting in my backyard one summer, watching water spiral down a drain, and spending an hour just thinking about why it spirals. I already knew the answer, angular momentum, Coriolis effect, all that. But I wanted to really feel it, to see it in my mind, to understand it from the water's point of view. Was that a waste of time? In terms of productivity, maybe. But that hour of thinking probably did more for my understanding of fluid dynamics than a week of reading textbooks would have done. Or I'd watch my kids play on a swing set and think about pendulums. Not the equations, I knew those, but the physical intuition. Why does pushing at just the right moment make them go higher? What's really happening with energy transfer? How does the system know what its natural frequency is? I'd push them and feel the rhythm and think about resonance, and suddenly I'd understand something about oscillating systems that I'd never gotten from textbooks. This is what I mean when I say I don't remember things. I don't have them stored away in some mental filing cabinet. Instead, I have this landscape of understanding in my mind. And when I need something, I navigate through that landscape. I reconstruct the idea from principles I know, from patterns I've seen before, from connections that make sense to me. And here's the beautiful part. Once you build this kind of understanding, it becomes almost impossible to forget. Not because you're trying to hold on to it, but because it's woven into the fabric of how you think. You'd have to unlearn how to see patterns, how to make connections, how to think, and that's not something you can forget. I suppose what I'm really describing is the difference between knowledge and wisdom, though those are awfully grand words. Knowledge is having the right answer stored somewhere. Wisdom is being able to figure out the right answer when you need it. Knowledge is remembering that force equals mass times acceleration. Wisdom is looking at a child on a swing and understanding, really understanding, why pushing at the right moment makes them go higher. And the path to this kind of wisdom isn't fast. It isn't efficient. It doesn't fit well on a syllabus or a study plan. It's messy and personal and sometimes frustrating. But it's also permanent. It's yours in a way that memorized facts never are. I think about the difference between learning a piece of music and memorizing it. You can memorize the notes, this finger here, that finger there, this rhythm, that dynamic, but if you lose your place, you're lost. You have to start over from the beginning or from some other anchor point you've memorized. But if you understand the music, the harmony, the melody, the structure, the emotional arc, you can never really be lost. You know where you are because you feel where you are. And if you make a mistake, you can improvise, adapt, find your way back. You're not executing a memorized sequence. You're creating something you understand. That's how I want to know things. Not as a sequence of steps to execute, but as a structure I understand well enough to improvise within, to adapt, to see from different angles. So if you're trying to learn something, really learn it, not just pass a test on it. Here's my advice. Slow down. Don't rush to memorize. Instead, ask why. Ask where it comes from. Try to explain it to yourself in the simplest possible terms. Play with it. Turn it around in your mind. Connect it to things you already know. And when you forget it, because you will forget it, don't panic. Go back and rebuild it. Each time you do, you're not just remembering. You're deepening your understanding. Make up your own examples. Don't just work the problems in the book. Create problems for yourself. Ask what-if questions. What if this parameter was bigger? What if that force was reversed? What if I changed this assumption? Each question leads you deeper into the structure of what you're learning. And be patient with yourself. Understanding takes time. It's not linear. Some days you'll feel like you're getting nowhere. Then suddenly, maybe in the shower or on a walk, something will click and you'll see it all differently. That's not a magic moment of inspiration. It's your brain working in the background, making connections, finding patterns. Trust that process. There's a humility in this approach, I think. It means admitting that you don't really know something just because you can recite it. It means being willing to say, I don't understand this yet, instead of pretending you do. But it also means trusting that if you put in the effort to truly understand, the remembering will take care of itself. I've spent my whole life learning things, and the older I get, the more I realize how little I actually know. But what I do know, I really know. Not because I have a great memory, but because I built each piece of understanding carefully, connecting it to everything else I know, until it became part of how I see the world. And that's what makes it worth it in the end. Not the facts you can recite, but the way understanding changes how you see things. When you really understand something, the world becomes richer. You see patterns you missed before. You make connections you couldn't see. Everything becomes more interesting because you have more ways of thinking about it. That's the hidden formula, if there is one. Don't try to remember. Try to understand. The rest follows naturally, like water running downhill. And that's not a trick or a hack. It's just how the mind works when you let it do what it does best. Find meaning, make connections, and see patterns in the beautiful complexity of things. So the next time you're trying to learn something and you feel the urge to memorize, to drill it into your head through repetition, stop, take a breath. Ask yourself, do I understand where this comes from? Can I explain it simply? Does it connect to anything else I know? Give yourself permission to be slow, to be thorough, to really think. Your future self, the one who still understands this years from now, will thank you.